We are live.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this morning's office hours on Unit 4. We're coming to you today from my office in Denny Hall, and Michael Blancato and Caitlin Clinton and Chad Iwerts are also here with us, and I believe we may be joined by some of the other faculty in the MOOC, but we wanted to go ahead and just get started with some of the questions that have come in either on the discussion forums or through our Gmail account. And one of the ones I want to start with has to do with multimodality. Prita posted to the discussion forums asking what other forms of multimedia presentation are possible for assignment 4. She asked whether she could use a Prezi template for the purpose, and if not, what other forms she might use. And she mentioned that her topic is food waste. And yeah, I think that Prezi could be one of the multimedia platforms that you could use for completing assignment 4. One of the things that's really interesting to me about this assignment is that because it follows assignment 3, you all have really developed some skills and flexibility and with the rhetorical use of visual images and visual argument. And so because of that, I can see why something like a Prezi format might be a really interesting approach to use or platform to use for assignment 4. And so my answer to Pretty just immediately is yes, but I think we want to also talk about making sure that as you compose this assignment that you do think very strategically about which medium and which platform is going to reach the audience you want to influence. And so a simple answer of yes, you can use a Prezi really doesn't get to the heart of what are some of the considerations that we want you to make as you think about the modalities that you're using and the distribution of the information to the audience that you're interested in reaching. I know Michael's sort of nodding his head. This is one of the areas that he and Caitlin and Chad in particular are really interested in. I don't know if any of the others of you have additional comments you'd like to make about multimodality and argument and rhetorical approaches.
I guess just I'm reminded of the PSA assignment where students had questions about how long that assignment should be, and same thing here. As long as you really think through what you're doing with the technology and how you are framing this assignment and can defend your use of the technology, then I think you should be okay.
Remember, too, that reminds me then, as you're thinking about composing this, look back at the assignment prompt for assignment 4 and look at the criteria that your peer reviewers are going to be using as well, because I know one of the elements there has to do with your integration of research material. And so one of the things you want to make sure of is that you are, in fact, employing and stepping into a conversation about your subject. For example, food waste, what Pretty was saying, is that one of the things that, that might be more challenging in a Prezi is how do you represent that conversation and how do you articulate the elements of being, B, E, A, and M, in a largely or primarily visual medium like Prezi. When I think about, or even an infographic where there's a little bit more alphabetic text maybe than in a Prezi, is how do you use the visual in creating, say, a background information and using sources as background. And so for me, just as someone who writes primarily in alphabetic media, I recognize that using words, in effect, is one of the best ways to situate, say, the background for a text. So think, too, then, as you think about your medium, your audience, your purpose, the distribution of the information to that audience and for that purpose, and then also how you might be using the sources that you're gathering, right, in the research that you're doing, and employing them strategically as background, exhibit, argument, and then methodology.
Can I chime in?
Yes, Caitlin?
1 second.
So I'm just going to try and... It's coming from your sound.
It's from speakers. Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that.
So as someone who does use Prezi a lot, I won't call myself a Prezi whiz, but I'm a Prezi whiz. I think that Prezi can really lend itself, I think, in interesting ways to Beam. I think that it can set up the context, like you can bring in multimodal elements, you can bring in YouTube videos, you can bring in images, and in some ways, I think depending on the topic, I think with food waste, it could really bring in some interesting visuals that set up the background, a show rather than tell, that you can allow your audience to kind of see what you're working with and also make their own arguments, their own claims about the materials. So it really, yeah, it all depends on your purpose, your audience, and what you're trying to get out of it. I don't think that in this case, Prezi is going to be a limiting factor. I think, if anything, it could really expand in interesting ways. All right, going muting now.
Well, and one of the things that Caitlin's response reminds me of is it also has to do with your proficiency with the technology. Because my answer was limited by my use of Prezi, which, as I said, is more alphabetic than it is visual. Excuse me. You know, so think also about your own comfort levels with and your proficiency with the technologies. Where I might be more inclined to move toward largely alphabetic text, Caitlin obviously is very comfortable using Prezi. And her examples, I think, are really good ones, right, about importing and using YouTube videos, for example, and other visual images to set up that background.
I wonder if Ben has anything to add.
Just to reiterate some of.
Oh, you're muted, Ben.
Am I muted now still?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was just going to reiterate what has already been said, which is, thinking about genre and medium is more than just asking procedural or technical questions, i.e., can I do it in this thing or that thing? It's about asking what would happen if I do it in this thing versus that thing. And that gets at, I think, a larger, maybe philosophical first premise about what rhetoric is, which is often about asking the question behind the question, right? It's not just about asking, can I do this? Well, yes, you can do this. Should you? Why should you? You know, what's to be gained or to be lost by choosing a path like Prezi versus something like a more traditional, alphabetic text? So one of the big goals of this course, as I see it, is to try to foster that way of thinking deeper about what it means to communicate in a given medium, in a given space, towards specific people, or any of those factors.
Thanks, Ben.
Sure.
There aren't any other really related questions. I was trying to kind of move thematically through some of the questions that we had in the Gmail account and that we'd sort of pulled from the discussion forum. So I think I'm going to move on to questions that are really more specifically about choosing a topic and finding a way into the conversation about that topic. Su'im writes that she was wondering how specific her message regarding her topic should be. In her case, she's writing about epilepsy, and a medical disorder that she thinks is not well understood. And she was thinking about writing a blog post or an article that explains just simply what epilepsy is and perhaps a little bit about the basic first aid that we might use or that we need to become familiar with to sort of assist if someone were to have an epileptic seizure. So that was one question. And then she notes herself that this is pretty general information, right? And it may actually be fairly well known, and that she's trying to find this space into a conversation about epilepsy that won't simply repeat what's already been said. And I think that that is one of the challenges of writing about causes, and it's a question that has really come up across the discussion forums in a number of ways. In another case, Priya had said there doesn't seem to have been, in her cause, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of change in the conversation over the past, several decades. And so if you're in and examining a cause that hasn't seen a lot of change over time, how do you step into that conversation? And one of these ways is to simply step back and examine what your particular interests are in the cause. In the case of Su'im, she says there's this lack of knowledge, but might she go ahead and move more specifically into sudden death in epilepsy? or bullying in epilepsy. And that's exactly the kind of brainstorming and sort of narrowing of a topic that might be very productive, might be a way of looking at this. So, for example, you have something like epilepsy, and if I were doing this as a sort of as a web brainstorming activity, I might put epilepsy in the middle of the page, and then I might connect it out to what other topics are related to it. Or when you think of epilepsy, what are the other subjects or issues that come up that are related to it? So, for example, here we would have epilepsy in the middle of the page, and we might have sudden death from epilepsy here and bullying over here. And I think just personally, if I were to respond to that, I hadn't ever thought about connecting a medical condition like epilepsy to something like bullying, because usually when we talk about bullying, and if it's the central topic on our web brainstorm, we don't necessarily connect it to medical disorders. We might connect it to disability or other kinds of difference like sexual orientation or sexual identity, or even other kinds of racial differences among individuals. But epilepsy wouldn't have been one of the connections I would have made myself. And so to me, that's an interesting take. It's an interesting way of entering the conversation, because it's not a connection that we typically make when we think about epilepsy.
I would also recommend, if you are having trouble coming up with a topic for this research paper, take a look at that Q&A session we did with Eli Goldblatt. He talked at length about how he discovered the causes that he became interested in, that he became an advocate for. So take a look at that. I think Eli has some words of wisdom for all you participants out there.
And one of the things he does say that was interesting was that he, what does he say? We don't find causes, causes find us. And that's why that bullying epilepsy connection was one that was interesting to me, because my guess is that Sui there may be something in your history, in something that you've experienced or have seen that might make that connection. You may know someone who has epilepsy that you know has been bullied. And what can come from that then too is the value of kind of personal experience and personal connection, which is what Michael has just related to us back from what Professor Goldblatt had talked about. And that personal connection, that interestedness, can be a very powerful tool when we write for causes. And I'm reminded also of Jay Heinrichs way back in Unit 2, where he talks about the value of being interested and having a kind of self-interest in a topic, and how productive that can be for our own ethos as we write and work and persuade. So let me turn on now next to some questions that Priya had. She mentions that it causes diversity in books and music, and by that I think she's very interested in examining the degree to which diversity is or is not present in film and literature. And so here she has a topic that is fairly broad, diversity, but she also recognizes that she wants to work within a couple of media, right? She wants to examine how diversity is situated or how it's presented in films and books. So her first question is, should I limit it to either books or film? And I think my inclination as a teacher and as a writer myself is to step back and say, well, before we ask that question about limiting it to a genre or a medium, is to ask a larger question, which is, what is the claim or the argument that you want to make about diversity in books or diversity in media? Is it that you think that, in fact, diversity is lacking? Is it that the diversity that is presented in problematic ways, that individuals, for example, of a particular ethnic group or racial group or gender are limited in how they're represented in those media? So part of it really is, for me, then investigating, and I would be encouraging someone writing in this to begin to flesh out a little bit more what her take is, what her approach is going to be, and what the particular nature of the cause is before limiting herself to books or film. Because it might be that you have some really good examples from both media, but before you can make that choice, you need to link it back to what it is you're particularly interested in arguing. And I'm going to pause for just a second to see if others have anything to add at this.
Me? This is something I deal with in traditional classrooms a lot when students are developing topics and trying to think about arguments. They're they're pursuing for main writing assignments. Oftentimes, I encounter students that have problems limiting or delimiting the scope of what it is they're looking at, precisely because they haven't thought about the argument they're trying to make. And so sometimes you get it in the opposite direction, where they're trying to look at all the things and trying to create this grand unified theory of whatever broad topic they're talking about, social media addiction, or I'm teaching a class now that deals with these kinds of issues. Are smartphones destroying the social fabric of our world? Thinking clearly about the argument that you intend to make, even if it changes along the way, I think is productive, because it puts constraints on what it is you're looking at and allows you to assess evidence in a more clear-eyed way, with purpose and direction. So yeah, absolutely, Kay.
Ben, that's really helpful for me too as I think about this, because what you mentioned reminds me of the notion of the evolving thesis or the evolving claim. And one of the things that is true for me as a writer, as I think about subject is, as I do research on the topic I'm working in, my orientation and understanding of the subject changes because of my engagement with what I'm reading. And so, for example, the social media addiction and our cell phones ruining the fabric of global culture. I might read something on that subject that presents a perspective that I hadn't considered, which might make me sort of rethink what my claim might be. I mean, I don't think cell phones are ruining the fabric of global culture right now, but I might be persuaded by someone who particularly addresses one issue maybe in a country or with a use of cell phone that I'm not familiar with. And so it's really important too, and that's an argument maybe for not delimiting too soon, and that to broaden our sort of investigation of a subject as we're getting into it, because then you have the opportunity to engage those voices in conversation that you might not otherwise have engaged. And that's why in Priya's question, she asked not only about books and film, but whether she should focus on the UK or the US as her primary sort of site of example, and whether she should limit that even to a particular time frame, looking at questions of diversity in film within, say, only a 5-year time frame. And all of those questions really are questions that are valuable to ask, and they might be important questions for her to ask. But again, I would want her to think about what her claim is first, and then begin to think about how she might limit it. For example, the question about whether she should use US or UK examples might also depend on who her audience is. If I were speaking primarily to a U.S. audience, and if my medium for distributing the information, my assignment 4, is intended largely for a U.S. audience, I might stick primarily with U.S. examples because that's what my audience is most familiar with, and those might be most compelling. On the other hand, if I'm imagining a more global distribution of my argument, I would say giving examples across cultures and across nations would be probably the better choice. But again, it's really all wrapped up again in exactly what our rhetorical purposes are and who our audiences are.
Yeah, so it's something of a balancing act, right? On one hand, you want to be able to identify your audience and speak effectively to your audience, but you also want to stay open and see where the argument takes you. You may find that you come up with a thesis statement that you just completely revise in the process of writing your research, and that's okay. Like if you stay open, you may find that you learn a lot just through the process of writing this research paper.
Yeah, and in fact, that can actually help you develop your ethos. For example, if you come into an argument and you can reflect on that previous self that held a different opinion, and you find that over time that the data that you're and the evidence that you're collecting changed your perspective, that can be a really effective sort of statement to make in some persuasive pieces of writing. Well, I used to think X, but then, over the course of conducting my research, I discovered, this particular argument, which persuaded me to change my opinion. And so it can actually be a very powerful sort of appeal through ethos. The final question that Priya had, again, I'm kind of pausing here a little bit to see if I see any hands raised about anyone else wanting to step into the conversation. She asked specifically about BEAM, and again, that's the work of Joseph Bishop, and if you haven't read the BEAM material, we really strongly encourage you to do that. It's a text, an article, and a methodology that we use a great deal in our teaching here at Ohio State, and that we use ourselves when we compose our own work. And again, it's understanding using sources, not just to sort of stockpile and have a hefty bibliography at the end of your piece, but using the research that you do strategically, using it as background information. Sort of, this might be, for some of you who are used to writing academic text, this might be your literature review. What's the background conversation, and what does your audience need to know and be aware of in order to come to your piece with a full understanding of the subject, or an adequate understanding of the subject? So I might use some materials that I've gathered as background information. I might use them as an exhibit, and that's the E in BEAM, which is, it's a piece, a case, an example, an artifact that I then analyze. It's an exhibit that I pull out and use to demonstrate a claim that I want to make. A is for argument. And so there it's a matter of who else and what other kinds of arguments are used or might you employ in support of your argument as well. So who else sort of aligns with you in terms of how you understand the subject and the claim that you want to make. And then finally, M is methodology. And this is, what are in methodology could be like, what particular kind of research methodology do you use, or what kind? So do you use? And I can't think of examples of anyone from the discussion forums offhand who are doing any kind of ethnographic work, or who might be pulling a kind of social science methodology, or a literary methodology, or a political science methodology in their work. But it's also pulling from your sources meaningful and informing concepts. For example, if there's a concept that one of your sources has used to understand, say, food waste. I'm going back to Pretty's example. If there's someone, or there's a primary concept about recycling and food waste that is pivotal for you, pulling that in and employing that would be an example of using a source as a methodology source. These are important because the BEAM is important because it allows you to think strategically about how you employ the sources that you're using. You don't just cite them and then move on to your argument, but you really engage them in meaningful ways. And so, as with a lot of our answers to the questions today, how you choose to use sources and whether you use them as B, E, A, or M will depend, again, on the argument and the purpose and the audience for your piece. You may not use sources in all four of those ways. It's not a requirement. We're not going to be looking to make sure that we see, or your peer reviewers won't necessarily be looking to see that you use B, E, A, and M. But they may very well say, I think you need more background sources here. I really felt as though, as a reader, I would have benefited from more elaborate understanding of the context, and so maybe a background source. And so we would hope that as you do the peer reviews for this, that you think about B, E, A, and M, because that might be a really helpful structure in talking with the writer about how the piece might have been more productively constructed in terms of its use of research. I'm seeing no hands up. Ben's hand is not up this morning. On this one, no, hands up like this. I don't know if there are other subjects that anyone would want to bring up that might not have been related to any of the discussion forum questions. I do have one, but I want to look around the room and at Ben to see if there was anything else that has come up this week as we've looked at the discussion forums that you all would like to address. No. Chad, is there a no? No. The one question or comment I think that did come into our Gmail account had to do, again, with peer review. And you all are now have had peer reviews on both assignment 2 and assignment 3, the synthesis essay and the PSA. And if you're working very, very quickly and you have submitted already 3 peer reviews, you could potentially be getting or seeing, and you're certainly giving peer reviews now on assignment 4. Is it not?
No,
was it not
the
turned in?
submission
Window just opened.
Just opened yesterday.
Yes, so the submission window just opened yesterday. So it's possible that you may be peer reviewing. No, I'm sorry, submission window. I'm sorry. The submission so next week, the peer review window will open. My apologies. Will open for peer review, and so this probably is a timely moment a kairotic moment to talk about this, because again, we are seeing some concerns among writers that the peer reviews that they have received on the PSA, so that second round of peer review, are still not particularly helpful to them. And they've made a number of observations, one of which is that it doesn't appear to some writers that all of you are using the describe, assess, suggest model when you're responding to one another's peer reviews. If you have not yet read the WEX guide, and if you're not following that process, or you don't understand the describe, assess, suggest model for responding to your peers, please review the WEX guide, go back, spend some time with that. We really do, well, I'll repeat this again, we really do see this model of peer review as based on a gift culture. That is, Michael and I are engaged with one another in responding to one another's work. It's anonymous, but we really do want you to think in terms of gift, because what you're doing as you're giving a peer review is you're giving the gift of your feedback to other writers. And you should think thoughtfully, and you should think very carefully about that gift that you're giving. Even though you have this sort of veil of anonymity, and in some ways that means you don't really have responsibility, right, for what you're giving to that person, you are giving of yourself and you're giving of your ideas. And that you should take pride and be able to take pride in what you've given and that you've done your best.
I've seen several discussion board posts from students who just are really, really thankful whenever they get feedback that is in depth, and when they get peer reviewers really take the time to analyze their work. I mean, you all are spending a lot of effort and energy, putting in a lot of effort and energy into these pieces, so it would behoove you to actually do the peer reviews and take your time with them.
And one of the things that we also know as teachers of writing, both in our classes at Ohio State and in the teaching of the MOOC, is that giving productive peer review and thinking strategically and thoughtfully about other people's writing is one of the best ways of improving your own writing. So if you're very dismissive in the peer reviews and you just, assign a number and give a short one-sentence response, you're not going to benefit from that as a writer. And what we know is those very, very detailed, thoughtful responses that Michael has just described are the ones that will help build your repertoire as a writer. And in fact, in the few times that we've taught and used this curriculum here on the Ohio State campus, our students here at Ohio State confirm this, that the best part of the peer review was not in the feedback that they got from their peers, but in constructing their feedback to their peers. And if you're not engaging in the peer review thoughtfully, you're missing out on an opportunity to develop yourself as a writer. So even if you're not motivated or persuaded by the gift culture, the idea that you give and you get, think about how you're limiting your own experiences and not taking advantage of an opportunity to develop as a writer by engaging fully as a peer reviewer. What happens then, too, we recognize that if we give robust reviews and we receive robust and helpful reviews, then when we reflect on our own writing, we're beginning to see connections and we're beginning to see elements of our own writing through the eyes of other reviewers, but also in our engagement with others' texts, and that improves our skills as writers.
Can I jump in just to say a couple of things? one thing to keep in mind is that WexMOOC is in some ways a rule-bound kind of procedural space. Uh, and our hope is that when you work through that process, describe, assess, suggest, and you assign value to the different criteria and so forth, that this is work that eventually will become more internalized and more organic, and by extension, and we're already seeing this to great effect, I think, people are taking that method and that way of thinking out into the discussion forums, out into the social media spaces, and I think it's important to think about how it is that we're taking those methods and those habits of thinking that we built into WexMOOC and repurposing them in other spaces. In fact, I was thinking about that just Sunday night when I was finishing a peer review for a journal article submission. I found myself deliberately thinking about describing what it was I saw in this article, assessing how well or not well I saw it doing certain things, and then offering suggestions as to how to make it better. It was a strong piece to begin with, but I found myself thinking, how can I contribute to this submission in order to make it even stronger? And so it's the kind of thing where you know, even if you're working in professional context, like you know, reviewing scholarly work, you still have the opportunity to demonstrate that kind of method.
I think one of the biggest challenges for writers using the describe, assess, suggest model and on our 5-point scale is they oftentimes will have difficulty giving feedback when they see something working really well, Ben, as in the example you just gave. Even though you had a scholarly article that you thought worked fairly well, maybe that you would have scored a 4 or a 5 on criteria that you were using to assess it, you still looked for meaningful ways to engage that text and to provide feedback to that writer. And that's something that I always strive to encourage in students, and it is something that I, again, do as a teacher. Even when I see a piece of student writing that's exceptionally good, I will always seek ways to encourage and sometimes challenge that writer to think even more in more complex ways about the subject that he or she has taken on. So even as we see writers who are doing really, really fine work that we're scoring 4s and 5s, we still want to make sure that you all use that describe, assess, suggest model, and that you find suggestions for maybe extending the argument, maybe moving in new directions.
I would also say it's really valuable to describe and assess what works well, because I think as writers doing peer review in any process, like for any assignment, if it's for, you know, a MOOC, if it's for a class, if it's for something professional, we get really hung up on critiquing, and we think of critique like as a negative, or like we're looking for the problems. That's kind of how academics are trained. But it's also just as valuable, like when you do have something that scores a 5, to point out why it works so well. So not only is that honing your skills as a reviewer to be able to assess like what this criteria is looking for and how it actually shows up in this paper, but it's also good to just provide that support and encouragement for writers, and I don't think that we do enough of that.
It's funny. So Chad and I just submitted a proposal to several faculty members here at Ohio State, and I mean they do what they preach. They juggle both positive and negative feedback so that you're not overly discouraged by the criticism, because it's balanced out by positive affirmation that gets you to want to keep writing.
And this is, as I think about this too, I think about the work of Joseph Harris, who is a scholar in writing studies, and he has a textbook called Rewriting that speaks to the act of revision. And one of the points he makes there echoes Caitlin's comments, and that is when we go to revise work, we often spend our time focusing on what isn't working, right? What we think might not be up to our expectations. But he also says that revision should be a moment when we look at what is working. And then maybe amplifying what is working. And so we can take Caitlin's suggestion and think about it in terms of peer review, but we can also think about it in terms of revision. One final point that I've seen come up from time to time on the discussion forums regarding peer review is an assumption that writers who are less skilled can't provide helpful peer review to more skilled writers. Our research from the first MOOC actually shows us that this is not the case. That is, that really strong writers are not necessarily the best peer reviewers, nor are the least skilled writers, and we determine that partly by the scores that they get from peer review, are not necessarily poor peer reviewers. I want to raise this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't want you to assume, and you're probably seeing this, that if you get high scores from your peers on your assignment, that it will necessarily follow that you get high marks as a peer reviewer. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand. So for those of you who do have some concerns about your own writing, or if you're not particularly proficient or effective as writers, you can still be, and probably are seeing, that you're a very strong peer reviewer and that you can be. We don't want to miss the opportunity to recognize that all perspectives that come to us on our writing can be helpful and productive perspectives, and that we shouldn't dismiss a peer review simply because we think someone, and I don't know how we would acknowledge or recognize that someone isn't a strong writer, but I think we sometimes assume that, and that is just simply not the case. So don't assume that if you believe you're getting a peer review from someone who isn't a strong writer, that the advice that's given there may not be helpful. In fact, we want you to look very carefully at those peer reviews and really try to see your writing through the eyes of the individuals who are peer reviewing you. Because their perspectives are probably and may be very, very valuable.
Another housekeeping question that came up in the discussion forums, a couple students were asking about the activities that we have in Unit 4 that are there in addition to the research assignment and the level up assignment. There's no due date. We don't have a due date for any of those activities, but we do recommend that you complete those activities in Unit 4 because they're designed to go hand in hand with the research paper and the readings that we've assigned in the 4th unit.
Okay. And continue to work on those level up activities. The same is true for those. There are no set due dates for the level up activities. If you are seeking the certificate of distinction, you need to complete 4 of those activities by the end of the course. Those level up activities.
I think it's November 21st.
By the date, by November 21st. It sounds like all of them need to be in, which is near the end of our 10 weeks together. Thank you again for watching or for uploading this at a later time and commenting. Again, remember that you can always use the Gmail account to send questions to us. We will not be having a typical office hours next week. We're going to be having a special kind of pre-recorded session on revising. So look for that next week, and we'll see you on the discussion forums.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.